and welcome to today's edition of TZM Global Radio Show. This is Matt Berkowitz. I'll be your host for today's show. For those of you who may not know me, I'm a coordinator of the Vancouver chapter of the Zeitgeist Movement. I have a guest today that I'm going to bring on very shortly. The guest is Victor Pross, an artist, philosophy major, and advocate of anarcho-capitalism, or free market anarchy, who I had a debate with a few weeks ago at the University of British Columbia here in Vancouver, BC, Canada. The reason I agreed to this debate was simply that I was asked by a sociology student at the university, suggesting that both sides would have their audience draws, and that it would be a good intellectual exercise. Before I bring Victor on, I want to recap the event that took place from my perspective. The debate event took place on July 13th and was titled, "What Social System Best Serves Humankind?" You can watch it now on the TZM official channel on YouTube. Apologies for the muddy sound. Transcriptions have been completed, so it's just a matter of time before the linguistics team is able to subtitle the video to make it easier to follow. So, the first thing to be said about the event was that it was a very respectful one. It never descended into a belligerent exchange of ad hominem attacks or anything of the like, unlike the debate's Facebook event page, which saw a lot of emotion-driven dialogue, fraught with logical fallacies and the like. You know, the typical stuff that goes on the internet where people often tend to act less civil towards one another due to the security of sitting behind a computer screen. Thankfully, none of this occurred live at the event. I'm not going to do a point-by-point rundown of everything that was discussed, but rather give some general impressions of what transpired and provide a few examples. Both of us started with our opening statements. I started by describing the benchmark that I'd be using to defend my position, that being natural law and the scientific method. I did a very brief criticism of several major attributes of the market system, doing my best to highlight that these attributes are part of the inherent mechanisms of the market, regardless of the degree of government regulation. These points seem to elude the anarcho-capitalists and are simply dismissed without relevant counter, blindly insisting that any criticism of the capitalist structure is really just criticism of the current so-called corrupted form of capitalism that they label corporatism or crony capitalism. I explained the underlying mechanisms, which are common to both, if you are to even make a distinction, and how the problems we see today are rooted in the psychology and mechanisms that are inherent to the market. I then went on to discuss the underlying train of thought and structural framework for a natural law, or resource-based economy, with the focus on the most critical attribute, that being resource management, and how we absolutely must use natural law as our economic referent for resource management if we are to remain sustainable, and thus maximize human well-being. This will, of course, be nothing new to those in the Zeitgeist Movement camp, but it was necessary to establish that base. Victor, on the other hand, starts out by suggesting that the resource-based economy is essentially repackaged communism, making a classic association fallacy, which I pointed out to him several times in the debate, including the beginning of my response. Victor then goes on to define the non-aggression principle, which, for those who don't know, is simply a moral stance that asserts that any use of violence is unjustified except in defense. He hammers home the point that any use of force or coercion is simply a moral wrong. I'll come back to this point soon. Victor then goes to define freedom as freedom from government coercion, and simply dismisses other possible definitions, such as freedom from the laws of nature, which of course don't exist, or freedom from the coercive nature of having to seek employment. He ignores the fact that in a monetary or market system, which he is about to introduce, that you are only as free as your purchasing power, and even then, you are highly limited. Then Victor goes on to state that capitalism is the social system based on individual rights, including property rights, and that these individual rights are based on the moral position that each person is an end to him or herself, not a means to an end of others, I believe in the words of Ayn Rand, and as such, people must be left to act on their own judgment, while upholding the non-aggression principle. He just assumes that the market system delivers this moral position. He then goes on to explain the classic free market position that government is an intruder in this process, and that all functions that the government performs today can be provided by the marketplace. He asserts, but doesn't qualify with any evidential support that I can see, that the market is nothing but people voluntarily exchanging goods and services dismissing or ignoring any form of corruption, manipulation, or exploitation that occurs in this process, and in the pursuance of one's own narrow self-interest through this medium. He just assumes that the market system of exchange delivers the non-aggression principle's moral stance. Victor goes on to finish by giving us an account of historical social progress through the lens of capitalist ideology, that it is capitalism that was responsible for all sorts of innovation and socioeconomic progress, without any qualification, by the way, making a causation fallacy. Nowhere throughout his opening statement does he explain how this system will best serve humankind, as was the title of the debate. No critique was even made of the resource-based economy other than an attempt to group it with a bunch of so-called collectivist ideologies and then shoot it down by association. He merely explained some of the philosophical underpinnings of the free market in its so-called purest form. Now, let's examine the main claim that I think is at the heart of Victor's opening statement, and then I'll bring him on to discuss with him, starting with the non-aggression principle. As I made this point at least once in the follow-up discussion, you cannot just assert a moral principle into a socioeconomic structure and then expect that that principle and structure will be uniform. As pointed out throughout the Zeitgeist movement's literature, laws exemplify the fact that the social environment produces aberrant behavior. Why else would they exist? They do not address the root causes of human behavior. And so too do moral systems fail to address the underlying social structure that produces behaviors and values that the moral system is trying to correct. In other words, these types of patchwork systems are admissions that the underlying social structure is insufficient. Once you realize that the structure of the market is based on producers competing for market share, and thus that winners and losers are inherent in the structure, breeding inequality, you start to realize that the consequential social environment is not conducive to bringing out the best of human behavior. Nor does it represent any relevant notion of freedom that one could devise, including Victor's extremely narrow definition as being free from government interference. Once we realize that the inherent forces and mechanisms of such a competitive and scarcity-based structure produce aberrant behavior, it is blatantly obvious that the market system in no way embodies the non-aggression principle that anarcho-capitalists hold in such high esteem. On the flip side, a resource-based economy is of course concerned with creating a social environment that brings out the best of human behavior by providing everyone with free access to goods and services using our most advanced applications of science and technology. There is no need to assert a moral principle to live by, which does not work, by the way. However, it is assumed that our goal as a species is to live in the most optimized, healthy way possible. All attributes of the resource-based economy model follow from the application of the scientific method to this goal. Of course, if one does not share the goal, there is no point to even having this conversation. On the whole, I really felt like Victor did not offer anything substantive at all throughout the whole event. Of the questions that were asked, many were not even answered by him, such as a question about preventing wealth consolidation that he first failed to address, and then when pressed, he said he wouldn't want to prevent it. I urge you to check it out yourself and form your own conclusion. And this is why I wanted to bring him on for the show and confront a lot of these questions head on.